Another strange text for us to work through this morning. So today, when we come to Jesus, what are we expecting? What are we expecting our lives to be like? Are we expecting our lives to be easier or to be more difficult? Does the Bible give us any insight into that? And that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today, this morning. When I was in high school, my best friend, his name was Jeremy, and I still call him a friend today. And he is a faithful minister of Christ, he's a Christian camp director in the Rocky Mountains and does a great job with that. But he wasn't always the responsible type. When we were growing up, he was the country kid. Everything that you imagine with a country kid, he was that guy. He was the guy that would wake up before dawn and would go pull calves out of heifers with his bare hands. He would, with him was always an adventure. He would drive his truck to the start of the field, and then he would set it in first gear. We'd jump in the back, no driver, and just throw hay bales out of his truck. And then before it hit the fence, he would run around and jump in the driver's seat again. This was just like everyday life with Jeremy. Hanging out with him always felt kind of like free labor, but that was okay, and it was always an adventure. And he worked hard, one of the hardest working guys that I've ever known, but he also liked to play hard too. What would every country boy love to do? Off-roading, of course, right? Most of Colorado, a lot of Colorado is public land, and so he would take his work truck out there and just tear up the desert. Twists and turns, ups and downs, bumps, jumps, sometimes a little bit going off track, always going too fast, but somehow he was always able to keep his truck on the road, and only he could do that. If anyone else was driving, I don't think that would be possible. He was always skilled in that. People in the truck were always like screaming like imminent danger is certainly coming upon us, but he always kept us safe through all of that. This is kind of a silly illustration to make the point of the chapter, that through the twists and turns in life, we can continue to trust God, who is going to keep us on the road. The main point for us today, because we believe that God is sovereign, disciples of Jesus don't look for the easy road, but we are willing to faithfully follow Christ even through difficulty. So as we jump into chapter 8 today, this is the chapter that is skipped in Daniel series. So if you go online and you look up pastors that are preaching Daniel series, chapter 8 might get skipped because it feels like there's not a whole lot there in this chapter. But we believe that all of Scripture is for our training in righteousness and for our spiritual growth. So am I going to skip it? You better believe I'm not, right? Of course we're going to be in it. So I believe strongly in expositional preaching. If I don't have to skip a text, I'm not going to. So here we're looking at apocalyptic literature. If you were there listening to Craig thinking, what are we reading? It was very odd, right? And I want to remember last week we looked at 4 keys to unlocking apocalyptic literature, and I'll give them to you again. Number 1, read it as narrative. So we're looking at the scriptures as a whole, trying to understand what is God trying to say to us in this text. We're not getting captivated by the small details and trying to figure out what is the fourth toe of this beast in this apocalyptic literature, right? But we're trying to see what is the overarching theme and what is God trying to show us. Number 2, we throw away the charts, and I'm overstating that, but we don't come to Daniel 8 with the charts and our preconceived ideas of what we think the scriptures should say. Rather, we believe that it is God's grace to our life, so we want that to be revealed to us. We don't read into the text, rather we see what does God have for us from the text. Number 3, we remember the purpose. The purpose of apocalyptic literature is not to satisfy our curiosity, but it is to encourage us towards faithful living. Again, I'll say it. The purpose of apocalyptic literature is to call us towards faithfulness and not to satisfy our curiosity. Apocalyptic literature, number 4, is for today. This is important for us. Though things are written in the historical future or our future, we want to remember that these things are meant for our spiritual growth and so that we can learn from them and be encouraged towards faithful living. And if you're asking yourself, what is apocalyptic literature? we're not thinking of zombies, and we're not thinking of whatever drama happened last on Netflix for apocalyptic literature. Apocalypse in the scriptures means revealing. So it's God pulling back the curtains of time so that we can look into the future, and God gives us glimpses to encourage us in this moment towards faithfulness. And then it's also a revealing of God to us as well. He's revealing himself. He's revealing Christ. He's revealing who we are. And he's also revealing the world around us as well, giving us insight into that. So let's jump into the text today. The first thing that we see is the scene for Daniel. And we see this is now the third year of Belshazzar's reign. 2 years have gone by since chapter 7. The location here is not random. So oftentimes, we smash 7 and 8 together in the scriptures, but there's a 2-year gap. Daniel's had quite a bit of time to contemplate what happened in the 7th chapter, and now we get 2 years later to the 8th chapter. And the location here that is chosen is not random. Daniel is actually living in Babylon at the time, but then he has this vision that happens in Susa. Susa is 230 miles away from Babylon, but it's critical for the Persian Empire. You remember the book of Esther? Do you guys know where it takes place? In Susa, right? Because it's critical for the Persian Empire. Also notice that the Ulai Canal is mentioned. The Ulai Canal would be critical for the Greek Empire as they would use it to conquer Asia. So guess what today's chapters are about? Persia and Greece, right? Important for Daniel's location. So we first look at Daniel's vision. That's point number 2, Daniel's vision. And you can see in your notes how we're going to move through the text this morning. We're first going to look at Daniel's vision, and then we're going to look at the explanation for this vision, and then we're going to look at Daniel's response. How does he respond to this information that he is given? So let's first look at the ram with the 2 horns that we see in verses 3 through 4. And you can follow along if you're not there yet, Daniel chapter 8. We'll move through the text kind of quick because it's a lot of verses. But James has a picture for us about the ram. This is for my visual people. Rams and goats kind of feel like the same thing, so I just thought that I'd throw this on the screen just so that you can visualize it, that these are 2 different creatures. Notice that the ram has 2 different sized horns, and then notice the one horn from the goat. This is just so that you can have this visual reminder in your head as we go through the text. So the ram we learn about from the text is Media Persia, and then the goat is the Greek Empire. And I'm not making this up. This is later on in the text that it is explicitly mentioned. Just like the bear is mentioned in chapter 7 for Media Persia, the ram also represents Media Persia. And from archaeology, we would confirm that in Persia, that the goat, that this ram is kind of a symbol for them. Pretend somebody from India comes over to the U.S. 100 years from now, so like 2,300 years, that somebody from India comes over and they find a paper that says 2020 and they see a donkey stepping on an elephant. We would all know what that means, right? We would be like, oh, it's a reference to the election and the Democratic Party won the Republican Party that year, right? We would all know what that meant. But somebody coming from India would have to do a lot more research into what does that actually mean? What do these characters symbolize? And that's what's going on here. Archaeologists have figured out that in Persia, oftentimes the leader of the Persian army would carry a golden ram's head as he would march in front of his army as a symbol of power and strength and conquest. So notice the 2 horns that happen, but the one came up later and was taller. And this is representative of the dual kingdom of Media Persia. And the empire started with Media, which was a lesser nation, and then Persia would join them and they would join forces, but it ended up that Persia was the stronger nation and they would be the stronger partner in this dual partnership. And northward, they would, notice in the text it says northward, westward, and southward. We now know from history that they would conquer Lydia to the north, they would conquer Babylon to the west, and southward they would conquer Egypt. And not a lot of conquest happened to the east for the Media Persian army, and that's why it's not mentioned in the text. And what do we know about these armies from verse 4? Look down at the text. Look at verse 4. What do we notice? They're arrogant and proud, right? And they can't be stopped. we can learn an important lesson from Daniel, that those who walk in pride, he is going to humble. And then we get to verse 5 and we see the goat, and the goat walks on the scene, or should I say, he flies onto the scene, right? He doesn't even touch the ground. He is quick and swift, so fast that it doesn't look like he's even touching the ground. And maybe you remember from last week when we looked at the leopard with wings, emphasizing that it is a fast and swift character. And this is representative of Alexander the Great, and he would have a conquest that would be unmatched in how fast he was able to conquer it. And he had a bone to pick with the Medo-Persian Empire, and he would go at them vehemently with his conquest, especially to Medo-Persia. So now we see Alexander the Great, one arrogant leader replacing another arrogant leader of the Medo-Persian Empire. And then Alexander the Great, his reign is pretty short. He's like 33, 34 or something when he dies. So he does this massive conquest early on in his life. It took him 3 or 4 years to have one of the greatest empires, and then he dies a few years later. And then his empire gets split up between 4 of his generals. As it says here, the 4 horns that happen. And if it's been a while since you took history class, it would be Macedonia, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt. And then verse 22 lets us know that these 4 rulers who divide up the kingdom do not have the same strength or power that Alexander the Great has, that he was the greatest, and then these 4 generals split up his empire. And then we get to verses 9 through 14. I promise this is going to be practical, okay? I know this is a lot of like history stuff, but I promise this is going to get practical, so hang on with me a little bit. Then we get to verses 9 through 14, and we see the small horn that is persecuting the people of God. And you are meant to think back to chapter 7 and the small horn from it. And there are similarities. Both of these 2 little horns are destroying God's people. They're striving for their own glory, but they're different characters. So the little horn that's in chapter 7 comes after the Roman Empire, and after that comes the kingdom of God. Here in chapter 8, we see a different little horn that comes after the Greek Empire, and we don't see the kingdom of God coming after that. So they're different, but they're similar in that they both oppose God, and they are both persecuting God's people. And they want to make a name for themselves, and they're prideful, and they're arrogant. These empires are great in evil. Notice that it says this comment that it makes about the Persian Empire, that the Persian Empire is great and that the Greek Empire is great, but then this little horn that comes up is 4 times great. It's mentioned 4 times in the text that it is great. And it is not great in the scale, but it's great in his wickedness. It's wickedness against God, and it's wickedness against God's people as well. So if you're curious of who this little horn is, most people would attribute the little horn to Antiochus IV Epiphanes of the Seleucid Empire. So Alexander the Great has 4 kingdoms that come down from him, and one of those kingdoms is the Seleucid Empire, and from that, a few kings down the line, we get Antiochus Epiphanes. Antiochus Epiphanes conquers Egypt to the south, Armenia, Parthia to the east, and then the glorious land, remember that from the reading as well, the glorious land of Israel and Judah, just like verse 9 says. And then in verse 10, this awful horn exalts himself even to the prince of the host, and it is likely God and his servant here that he is exalting himself towards that. Antiochus Epiphanes, we know from history, was a little bit of a madman. He was just crazy in his conquest, and historians describe him as just a little bit insane. But he thought he was God manifested here on earth. So much so that he had coins printed with his head on it, and then it said God manifest across the bottom. So he believed that he was God here on earth. And then verse 12, we see that the host will be taken over, and the burnt offerings will be stopped, and then he will throw truth to the ground. And the transgression here is referring to Antiochus and the evils that he is going to do. in destroying the people of God, in removing their daily sacrifices and throwing truth to the ground, and then raising himself up against God. When Antiochus Epiphanes comes to make war on Jerusalem, he enters the temple and he establishes a false god that is worshipped. Some people attribute it to Juniper Olympius, or some people say that it's Zeus. It's a sacrifice for Zeus that he sets up, and then he has a yearly festival in his name for himself on his birthday. Antiochus Epiphanes removes Jewish sacrifices, and then he also removes Jewish traditions, and he removes the Torah, and he removes anybody that's practicing the Torah as well. So he would take Torah, all the Torah that his army could find, and they would rip it up, and they would throw it into the fire and burn as many Torah scriptures as they could. And then if you were caught practicing the Torah, then they would also kill you. One of the things that's talked about in the Torah is circumcision. This is how God wanted to identify his people. This is a sign of the covenant that they would follow him in circumcising their boys. But Antiochus Epiphanes said, well, if you're practicing Yahweh and worship of Yahweh, then you're not worshiping me, and I'm going to kill all of the baby boys that have been circumcised. So he did that for his entire reign. And he would kill the parents as well, and he would kill any practitioners of the circumcisions as well. And because of the mixed audience, I can't say the way that he did it, but it was graphic. Verse 13, this is kind of like a break from the text. This text has been pretty dark and glum. And then verse 13, there's a slight break in it when the angel is standing there and watching, and he says, "How long?" If you remember, this is what we read from Psalm 74 as we started the service today too. How long, O Lord, are you going to let this wickedness continue? As Daniel is in this vision and he's watching this stuff happen, I'm sure that this was on his mind as well, when he's thinking, how long, O Lord, is this stuff going to continue? How long before you step in and you end evil? It seems like evil's winning. How long before you step in? And if we're honest in our lives, right, we feel like this too. We see evil sometimes around us, and it seems like it's winning, right? We see the evils that happen around us, and we're like, God, how long are you going to let this stuff continue? How long will this go on? The person that I mentioned that I was talking to online, you have no chance of meeting her, so I think I can safely reference it. She was going through some difficulty with somebody that treated her family really badly, and they got away with it, right? In an awful way. And she was struggling with why does this happen, right? Why does God allow this stuff to happen? And why is this person lifted up and people seem to glorify this person that treated her family really badly? This is typical for lament scriptures. We could find this in Isaiah, Jeremiah, Zechariah, Psalm, Revelation. How long, O Lord? People crying out. Verse 14 gives us the answer. 2,300 days. You're probably better at math than I am. So I took like 10 years of post-high school education, and I never had to take a math class. So math, not my forte, but I hear 2,300 years or 2,300 days, and I'm like, I don't know if that's 2 or 20 years. I'm not sure. But thankfully, somebody's done the math for us, and it's about, some of you can probably do it in your head, but it's about 6 to 7 years. So it's between 6 and 7 years that happens. And why is this significant? The biggest reason for us to understand the 2,300 days, rather than figure out the details, is remember that big overarching theme that we're trying to understand, is that God knows the end. God has the end planned, and he is working towards that end. He is able to use the wickedness that is in the world to bring about his intended purposes and his plan. Now we'll go down a rabbit hole just a little bit and get into the details of the 2,300 days and what they mean. So commentators are kind of split on this. There's 4 or 5 different views, but 2 main views with how they see the 2,300 days. And you could read for this 4 days. You could probably read about this topic for 2,300 days if you want to. If you want to, let me know, and I'll send you a bunch of PDFs about it. So the 2 main views are that the 2,300 days are actual days, or that there are 2,300 mornings and evenings, meaning that there would be 1,150 days. And both of these dates are significant. Most commentators agree on the end of these 2300 days, but the confrontational point is when the start of those, the end of when the start of those 2300 days is. So if it is 2300 days, people would say that the start of those 2300 days would be when Antiochus Epiphanes first rises up against Jerusalem and first comes to destroy the people of God. And he kills the host, if you remember that in this text. He kills the host, Onias III, who's the high priest in Israel at the time. And this was in 171 or 170 BC. So that would be one start date for the 2300 days. And if you want to go to the 2300 mornings and evenings, it would be 167 BC when Antiochus Epiphanes doubles down and he goes into the temple and he sacrifices to Zeus on the altar of Yahweh, which was just awful for the Jewish people to experience that. And people would say that that was the start of the 2300 mornings and evenings. So no matter what start day you have, the end date is when Antiochus Epiphanes is finally destroyed, and then the Jewish faithful people, the Maccabeans, would reestablish the temple and reestablish it to Yahweh and rededicate it to Yahweh. That would be the end of the 2300 days. So either way, no matter how we want to work out the math and the history, we remember that God is bringing about his plans and his purposes. Chapter 7 really focused on the victorious ones. If you remember, the focus is on the Ancient of Days and also the one that is like the Son of Man, and they were coming to crush the little horn between them, right? So remember the Ancient of Days and then the being God, and then the one like the Son of Man, Jesus, coming to crush that little horn and crush wickedness and evil between them. But interestingly enough, this text, Daniel 8, is really focused on the antagonist of the story, the wicked people, the villain of the story. And interestingly, I think it's been interesting to watch culture in the last 20 years when we've kind of been focused on the villain stories, right? Think about the movies that have come out recently focusing on the villain stories. Think about the movie Wicked that just came out earlier this year. Think about Cruella. Think about Joker that came out a while back, focusing on the villains. But understanding these villain characters helps us understand how they affect the protagonist of the story, and they help us to see the overall plan, the grandeur of the plan, and the grandeur of the narrative, right? Understanding these negative villain-type characters helps us understand the bigger picture as well. And this is what God is doing here for us in Daniel chapter 8. And remember, the main theme of Daniel, I've said it too many times probably, right? God is sovereign, right? And we should humble ourselves before him, or we will be humbled by him. And this is the message that he is trying to get across here, that from a different perspective, from the perspective of the villain of the story, this ram and this goat, that God is still in control, and God is working out his purposes and his plans. Okay, that was a lot. So what am I supposed to do with all of this stuff, right? That text was a lot. What am I supposed to do here? I can think of two applications already from the text for us. First, we can be thankful to God that he has a plan for history and that he has revealed it to us. We can be thankful for how accurate the scriptures are, that hundreds of years before the Persian and the Greek Empire, that God revealed this to Daniel. And this is why we've talked about several times that lots of critical scholars say there's no way Daniel could have predicted this stuff because it's too accurate. And second, and more applicable to our lives, is the issue of pride. And we see this as the fight continually for humanity as we struggle for pride in our lives. Think about how this even goes back all the way earlier to the Garden of Eden. What does the snake tempt Eve with? He's not tempting her with a fruit, right? He is, but he's not tempting her like, hey, leave God because this fruit tastes really good, right? It's a lot more than that. He's saying, do this because you can be like God. He's speaking to her pride, right? You can be like God. You can exalt yourself before God if you do this. He's speaking to her pride. And we see this throughout humanity, that this is our fight as well. We don't want to humbly submit before God. We are made in God's image, and we are meant to bear his image, but instead we want to bear our own image, right? We glorify ourselves. We want to exalt ourselves before people. We want to say, look how great we are. Give credit to ourselves rather than give glory to God. And this is why we need Jesus, right? Jesus comes to us. We learn throughout the book of John, the Gospel of John, that Jesus comes to reveal God to us. He comes to glorify God with his life, right? He comes not to make a great name for himself, but to make a great name for God, to glorify God. And now, because of Jesus, he has restored us so that we can now again bear God's image in a correct way, so we can glorify God to those around us instead of ourselves. So next, let's look at Gabriel's explanation. And we'll read this in verses 15 through 25. When I, Daniel, had seen the vision, I sought to understand it, and behold, there stood before me one having an appearance of a man, and I heard a man's voice between the bank of the Ulai, and it called, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. So he came near where I stood, and when he came, I was frightened and fell on my face, and he said to me, understand, O son of man, that the vision is for the time of the end. And when he had spoken to me, I fell into a deep sleep with my face to the ground, and he touched me and made me stand up. He said, behold, I will make known to you what shall be in the latter end of the indignation, for it refers to the appointed time of the end. As for the ram that you saw with the two horns, these are the kings of Media. These are the kings of Media and Persia, and the goat is the king of Greece. And the great horn between his eyes is the first king. And for the horn that was broken in pieces of the four others arose. 4 kingdoms shall arise from his nation, but not with his power. And at the latter end of the kingdom, then the transgressors have reached their limit. A king of bold face, one who understands riddles, shall arise. His power shall be great, but not by his own power, for he shall cause fearful destruction, and shall succeed in what he does, and destroy mighty men and the people who are the saints. By his cunning he shall make deceit prosper under his hand. And in his own mind he shall be great. Without warning he shall destroy many, and he shall even arise up against the prince of princes, and he shall be broken, but not by human hands. So as we look at this text, we see the angelic encounter that happens first. And this angelic interpretation here is a little bit interesting. We know that Gabriel is somewhat of a high-ranking official in God's army, right? Think about how he is the one chosen to come to Mary and reveal to her that she's going to give birth to the Savior of the world. But there's somebody here that is speaking to Gabriel, somebody that has authority over Gabriel, one that has the appearance of a man here. I wonder who that could be. And then Daniel, we see the Son of Man. He has this title, Son of Man, that is given to him, emphasizing his humanity, right? Reminding him that he has a human perspective, that he doesn't have the perspective of God, not God's perspective. And maybe the issue for Daniel is not just that he doesn't understand, but that he isn't willing to really accept it. Daniel is struggling with the reality of this good versus evil struggle. And this is the reality that we struggle with too. Why, God, do you allow evil to continue in the world? Why are you continuing to battle darkness and Satan? And from a human perspective, we don't understand. But from God's perspective, he is using evil to bring about his plans and his purposes. Notice verse 7, how it says, this is for the time of the end. And notice something interesting also that happens in verse 19. He seems to be saying that these events are to help us understand the latter end events that are going to happen, the end of wrath as well. We understand from the rest of Daniel, chapter 7, chapter 9, chapter 11, that Antiochus Epiphanes is a type of people that persecute God's people, right? He's a type of person that comes to destroy God's people and stand against God's people. Understanding Antiochus Epiphanes helps us understand the future time as well. God is saying, look at this specific case for understanding the entire plan of God here. And also, God is using current evil events for his restoration plan. God is using the evil for his restoration plan. Think about how Media Persia, God uses Media Persia to bring back Israel to the promised land, right? Think about how God uses Greece to unify the world under one language, one writing language of Greek, that would then be the language that gets the New Testament, right? This is why Christianity was able to spread so rapidly, because of the Greek language, having one unified language. And then think about God using the Roman Empire and taking Caesar Augustus, right? Think about Caesar Augustus taxing the world and then having people travel for these taxes. And then what was the purpose in that? So that Jesus could be born in the promised place of Bethlehem. Evil cannot help but bring about God's purposes. Even while they are doing their best to oppose God, they're bringing about his purposes. God uses all people for his plans, both the ones that are his and the ones who aren't, the ones who desire to submit to God and the ones who don't desire to submit to God. We see the interpretation of the ram and the goat, right? If you've been curious about who is this talking about, it's just explicitly stated that it's going to be Media Persia and Greece, long before these events would actually take place. And then in verse 23, it begins to explain the rash, rebellious king and his awful acts. And notice something interesting, that the power does not come from himself. And this is showing that this is greater than just Antiochus Epiphanes. This is great. This is the great plan of God, right? And people being opposed to God. Antiochus Epiphanes being used by evil forces to oppose God and relentlessly against the people of Israel without mercy. And then in verse 25, it says that the small horn will be broken apart, but not with human hands. Did you guys catch that? Not with human hands. And what does that mean? It would take more than a human force to destroy Antiochus Epiphanes. God would need to step in against that. And do you know how Antiochus Epiphanes dies? Not with human hands. Listen to how one historian describes the death of Antiochus Epiphanes. I'll read it to you. And this is a Jewish historian, so he's writing from his perspective of God being the one who intervenes. But listen to how Antiochus Epiphanes dies. But the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, smote him with an incurable and invisible plague. For as soon as he had spoken these words, a pain of the bowels that was remediless came upon him, and sore torment of the inner parts, and that most justly, for he was torn southport, manateed other man's bowels, and many strange torments. Howbeit he nothing at all ceased from his bragging, but still was filled with pride, breathing out fire and rage against the Jews, but commanding to haste the journey. And it came to pass that he fell down from the chariot, carried violently, so that, being a sore fall, all the members of his body were in much pain. So he has two things, just in case you thought one supernatural event wasn't enough, he has two things that happen. He gets thrown from his chariot, and then he also has this incurable, awful disease that happens to his inward parts. And it's because of these two events happening that then he dies. Really interesting. Not with human hands. Let's look at the last two verses as we finish up the chapter. 26 and 27. The vision of the evening, this is 26. The vision of the evening and the morning has been told, is true, but seal up the vision, for it refers to many days from now. And I, Daniel, was overcome, and lay sick for many days. Then I arose and went about the king's business, but I was appalled by the visions, and I did not understand it. So Daniel has this dream explained to him, and he still doesn't quite understand it. He's struggling with actually accepting it. So after being sick for a few days, Daniel rises and goes about the king's business again. A king, remember, that is not a king in Judah or Israel. This is a wicked king that he goes up and serves again. In verse 26, Daniel is told to seal up the books. Though Daniel does not understand entirely, people in the future would need this book as a reminder to know that God had a plan for them, that he had this plan for a long time ahead of time. Jesus does a similar thing with his disciples in John 16. He tells the disciples, you're going to go through suffering. You're going to go through hard times. Life will probably not be easy for you. But Jesus tells them this in John 16:1, I have told you these things so that you don't fall away. I think that is going on here as well. Jesus tells his disciples that though they're going to suffer, that I'm going to keep you through it, that there is a great promise for you at the end of this suffering. And he tells us this so that we don't fall away. This is what's happening here in our text as well. So seal it up for now. For someday, people are going to need this message, and they will need to know that God has a plan, and even through the evil and the wickedness that happens around us, God is using that stuff. Through the twists and the turns, we can put our trust in God. Let's look at the Beyond the Walls. This is where we look at how does this actually apply to us outside of these walls for this week? What do I do with this information on Monday? If you're here with us today and you have not yet received Jesus or made a decision to follow him, this chapter is a message of hope for you. Hope that God can use the wickedness and the evil stuff that is in your past, and he can use that to draw you to himself, and is using that to draw you to himself. And no matter what you've done, even if you think that you're too far gone, God wants you and is calling you to himself, even through the wickedness that is in your life. The story of God using human evil is best expressed on the cross. The cross is the pinnacle of injustice and transgression and suffering. When God's perfect and holy Son takes on the world's sin, our wickedness he takes on. Jesus takes on the awful parts of humanity so that we can then have a relationship with God. If you want to know more about that and how you can have a relationship with God, please come and talk to me after the service or one of us here. The gospel in this chapter is good news for all of us. We don't have to be embarrassed by our past. I think that this is a huge application from this text. We don't have to be embarrassed about our past. Rather, we can see it as God's grace in our lives and how he drawed us to himself. It is God's grace that he was able to use the negative stuff in our past and the negative parts of the past before we knew God that he was using to draw us to himself. So we don't have to be ashamed by our past any longer. Rather, we can see it as a means of God's grace in our lives and how he rescued us from our sin. To those of us that are following Christ, trials in this life are meant to turn us towards God and be more reliant on God and less reliant upon ourselves. And we should treat them like that. When we go through difficult times of pain in our life, it's always good for us to take those requests to God and to ask for help. But we don't want to treat God like a cosmic Santa Claus with our wish list of how we think that life should go, right? This is not how we approach God. But rather, we as the people of God embrace hardship that is going to happen in our life as the means by which God is using and bringing about his plans. And though it's hard in the moment, we know that it'll be worth it. When we go through trials, instead of asking and looking for it to be removed from our lives, rather we embrace them with readiness in a way that we get to be used of God to bring about his plans. And the way that this chapter ends is abrupt. Think about what Daniel does after some turmoil that his soul has, and after experiencing the sickness that he has from these visions that he's received, he gets up and he's faithful in the task that God has called him to do. And this is faith, living in the surety of the unseen and in the hope of what we have yet to experience. And this is the example of Daniel to us. God continues on to be faithful in the present moment of our lives. And so we continue to be faithful as well to him. Even though we don't have all the answers, and even though Daniel didn't have all the answers, and even though he doesn't quite understand, he knows what God has called him to in this present moment, so he's going to take that and be faithful. And so it is with us. We might not understand God's overarching plans. We might not understand the wickedness that happens around us and the weird stuff that happens around us, but God calls us to faithfulness in this moment of our lives. So we continue to be faithful in our scripture reading daily. We continue to be in prayer, in relationship with God. We continue to be good husbands, good wives, good children, good parents, good grandparents, good employees, good students, good workers, all the things that God has called us to do. And even though the roads in our life will be bumpy, we can trust in God. Restoration is coming. Our King has promised to return, and we look forward to that day. Let's bow our heads and close our eyes for a moment as we think about taking communion here in just a moment, and we reflect and we examine our own lives. Take a moment to thank God that he is able and powerful enough to use the wickedness and the evil in the world for his purposes. And then take a moment to ask God to help you with faithfulness in what he has called you to. And then take a moment to ask God to reveal in your lives the ways that maybe you are not being faithful in what he has called you to. And thank him for Jesus being the way that we can find peace with God and that we can have a relationship with God and being drawn to faithfulness because of Christ.